Welcome to The Witch's Table, a conversation between everyday witches about the magical, the mystical, and the mundane. Presented by The Witch's Altar, where no witch walks alone. And now, your host, Luana, owner and artisan of The Witch's Altar.
Hello, welcome to The Witch's Table. I'm Luana.
I'm Rain.
And today we are going to be discussing the history of witchcraft. Kind of. And I'll get into what the kind of means, because the history of witchcraft is absolutely convoluted and is unfortunately very enmeshed and mingled together with Christianity, and I want to make sure that we are talking more so about the witchcraft aspect and less about the Christianity part, because I could talk about that all day. And we actually have a guest today. Yeah, thank you. Shayna is here with us today. She is our resident historian at the Witch's Table, the group that we run. And Shayna, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and why we want you here talking?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I am a huge history nerd, but also I have a degree in history with a specialization in classics. I also do a little bit of historical reenactment, and I guess, persona that I reenact is a historical figure that has ties to the witchcraft community. So I've done extensive research on historical witchcraft.
Awesome. Yes, that's exactly what we want to make sure that the focus is. In preparing for this podcast, because I had talked to you about this podcast for months, and I was like, I want to really do this, and you know a lot about the history of witchcraft, and I feel like people really need to know where all this is coming from, and especially with the political climate and the way that things have been going, I feel like it's even more necessary to understand what witchcraft historically has been and what it turned what witchcraft is now versus what was labeled as witchcraft in the past versus what magic was, right? Because magic is different than what in Europe they called witchcraft. And I think the biggest thing for me is the Bible verse of "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And it's kind of like, well, when did the term witch even get used? So Shayna, can you tell us a little bit about where did witch even come from? What is that word?
So the word witch actually is, the way that we use it at least, is a fairly modern term. So the way that well, most of us at least spell it, W-I-T-C-H, is dated to the 16th century, which is remarkably late in human history. I mean, it's within the last 500 years, obviously. Prior to that, there was a couple of different words that were similar in sound, absolutely. And that's where we actually get the modern the name for the religion Wicca from, was actually the Old English version of the word witch. But it's, again, a very complicated concept because before the 16th century, the Wicca was divided into masculine and feminine, sub-words, forms of the same word, basically. And they both were derived from, well, we suspect, we can't prove obviously, but they are thought to be derived from an old word that essentially means diviner. The Proto-Indo-European root that we think it comes from literally means to separate or to choose, like the casting of lots, basically.
Really find that interesting too, though, because from what little research I have done is that in Greek there are terms for many different types of magic. Like, magic was done by everybody. It was just a thing. You would go down the street. And so do you have any kind of information on maybe why that specific word was chosen over any of these other ones for like witch. Like we got witch from this other word. Like why did we choose that?
So I personally believe that it is highly based on the church in the Middle Ages, leaning very heavily into anti-magic propaganda, essentially, because the Bible does specifically say in a couple of places, divination is bad, baneful magic is bad, poisoning people is bad, things like that. And I'll get a little bit more into that when we start getting into the actual definitions of, like, because I really want to break down like that line that you mentioned when we first got started, suffer not a witch to live, because that has been grossly mistranslated in the last few hundred years. And the type of magic that the church leaned most heavily against, in my opinion, was actually divination, for a lot of reasons. And again, this is opinion based because the church punished most witchcraft, at least across the board, equally. But it seems like fortune tellers were among the groups that were most heavily like sought after and punished. And in my opinion, there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's why I think that the word witch was the one that ended up getting chosen for this particular like umbrella of practices that needed to be punished, was because the word originally was tied most heavily to divination, and divination was seen as the problem.
Yeah. I have my own opinions on why divination was seen as a problem, and I can talk all day, so I don't want to do that. But do you have your own opinion about why specifically divination was demonized so heavily?
I believe that divination was seen as the easiest to tackle problem with witchcraft, because divination was basically giving power back to the people in an area that they normally went to the church for. Basically, divination, one of the purposes of divination is to reassure the person who is trying to get the divination. Like they want a sense of, like they know what's coming in their life, they know what they should do, what path they should take. And that is a role that the church plays in the lives of a lot of religious people. Not to vilify religion at all, because religion can be a good thing, but when the church is actively trying to make you more dependent on it, divination is one of those things that just has to go. Power-wise, divination makes you less dependent on the church.
I mean, that's pretty much been what I have been seeing too, and this can stretch throughout time. Um, because, man, where was I going with this? Sorry, brain fart. Yeah, so I have seen this in my what minimal research I've done, which I say minimal, but like I've listened to like 4 audiobooks and like 8 podcasts. Anyways, um,
I wouldn't call that minimal.
No, not at all.
this is like an ADHD, this is my hyperfixation right now. Yeah, so I've done a lot in like 2 months. So not a whole lot of time, but like read a lot of shit. But from the things that I've been looking into, whether it be witchcraft specifically or just the Christian church, it seems like anytime there is anything else around it that challenges the mysteries of the church, that challenge Jesus's miracles, anything that would be deemed as a miracle. If it's challenging that, if it makes it look like, well, why would I go to church? Then they instantly attack it and demonize it. And that's something that, I started going down a rabbit hole of the spiritualist movement, and this happened in the spiritualist movement. You had these women who were channeling these deceased people, whether they were just regular people or really famous people. A lot of the ones who did like the live mediumship seances, they were channeling like big names, and they were all advocating for like equality and stuff like that. And the church was immediately like, nope, they're not really talking to those people, they're talking to demons. And immediately was like, let's attack, let's do like a smear campaign. Let's just get rid of it. I mean, and that's been since, from my research on Christianity, has been since the beginning of like how it started, was let's demonize everybody else to make us look better, because we don't want Jesus to look like a chump when you can go to Susan down the street who's going to do it for a nickel. You know, like
Would agree with you to a certain extent. I think that the early church, like back when it was just a mystery cult, it probably wasn't so focused on power. It was more focused on, helping the downtrodden, which is what it claims to be now. Very loosely claims to be. But I do think that once it became institutionalized, it started attacking anybody that disagreed with it, anybody that um, was problematic. And that also leads into like racial groups who were known for divination practices and things like that. They were also very heavily, policed and punished by the church. Racial groups that, in some cases are still being policed and punished even today, with anti-Semitism and like laws actually like against like uh, ethnic groups like the Rom.
yeah. Can you explain that to people who are listening if they don't know what that is?
Sorry. So the Rom or the Romani people, often called travelers, basically, I don't want to use the slur that is most often associated with them, but it's the G word. Basically, it is derived from their association in the Middle Ages with Egypt, if that
Mm-hmm.
helps at all. But they were a culture group that a lot of people associated with fortune telling and divination, and they end up being very heavily demonized by the church, sometimes quite literally. Um, Basically accused of devil worship, eating babies, kidnapping children and women, all kinds of stuff.
Jewish people were also accused of eating children,
Yeah.
and their synagogues were supposedly the site of devil worship in the night. So anytime a kid was sick, they just went straight to the Jewish community and they were like, kill them all, and they did. So,
I mean, and that is there's also a reason why a lot of the witchcraft craze in like the late 1800s drew very heavily on Jewish mysticism was because the Jewish community even then was seen as a magical and demonic people, even though even at that point they had largely stepped away from that view of the Jewish community. There still was like an undercurrent of distrust and superstition associated with them, very heavily. So you have a lot of groups using stuff like Solomon's Seal and the Kabbalah and things like that that are very loosely stolen from Jewish mysticism.
yeah. Which, I mean, anyone who's done, really deep dived into tarot, the Golden Dawn had that specifically be tied to the Kabbalah, and they've kind of made their own Kabbalah basically, very loosely based off of what was already there in Jewish mysticism. Um, but just so I understand, are you saying that Jewish mysticism kind of fell out of favor because they were trying to distance themselves from that, and then the occultists took it up because it was already kind of believed that they were super special, mystical, or like I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, so honestly, the Enlightenment kind of saw a lot of culture groups distance themselves from earlier mysticism. Um, and then you saw the Romantic era, which followed on the heels of the Enlightenment, kind of swing the pendulum back in the opposite direction, where it was like all these culture groups were suddenly trying to rediscover their mystic roots in a lot of ways. And then, of course, following on the Romantic era, you had the groups like the Golden Dawn, for example, going back into earlier writings. And my favorite thing is when they would supposedly find these ancient teachings hidden in a library, squirreled away somewhere, and it's like you didn't find that, you
You
wrote
made
that.
that,
Yeah.
yeah. Crowley, talking to you.
Oh, he was far from the even the worst offender. Like
I
we like
know.
to we like to bash on Crowley because he's funny, but
He's such a fucking asshat, and I love his tarot deck because there's penises everywhere. It'll be like a card about a woman, and then there's just a big phallic symbol in the background. You're like, dude, what are you doing? Anyways.
Yeah. I mean, Crowley, if absolutely nothing else, he was a very good salesman. He knew sex sells.
Yeah, absolutely. He had, I don't know, he was a lot. But yeah, so that's interesting, because we see the term witch, but then there's all these other groups that get lumped in with that word. Not just what we think of as witch now, which is like a magic practitioner, people who do divination, right? Like when we say witch now, we've kind of I kind of almost view it like we've reclaimed that word. It was a negative word. Nobody wanted to be a witch. That wasn't a thing. Like witch was bad.
Yeah.
And so we use it now, and some people use it and they don't understand why they're getting funny ass looks from the normies. It's like, well, you're also trying to fight against years of church propaganda and oppression of women and oppression of other minority groups, and like that's hard to combat. And especially here in America, like we have a lot of freedom to kind of do whatever we want, but we still get looked at crazy, you know what I'm saying? Or at least we can do what we want right now. But I'm gonna get put on a watch list after this if I'm not already. So let me ask you this: what, when we did start using that word, right? Because you said this was what, the 1600s.
The early 1600s, but I'd say even into the late 1500s, even earlier than that.
Okay. So when we started using that word witch, what was a witch? Because this is a European concept, right? Because one of the books I read, The Witch, A History of Fear from Ancient Times to the Present by Ronald Hutton, I will link that in the show notes. But he kind of goes all the way back to like the beginning and looking at all these other cultures where magic existed. And he was like, if we're going to look at the witch, we can look at what Europeans thought the witch was, and then look at other cultures to see what that looks like. And other cultures had like a idea of like a witch figure. So what is the witch figure?
So my specialization is Western history.
Mm-hmm.
I am very much a classicist, so I know a lot about like the Mediterranean, the ancient Mediterranean, and the like Germanic regions, and some into the Norse and Northern Europe. But most of what I know is actually like ancient Greece and Rome and some of the Middle East. So I can't speak too much on other cultural
Well, that's
areas
fine. Yeah.
except to say that, in the Far East, for example, the equivalent kind of figure that we have to a witch in our society was not looked on anywhere near as poorly, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
as we do here in the West. Same thing for Africa. They actually they deeply respected their magical practitioners for a very long time, and I would say Europe also deeply respected most of its magical practitioners up until Christianity really got a foothold in Europe. I will say that, I mean, most everybody, as you said, I believe earlier in the podcast, most people practiced magic in one form or another before the advent of Christianity. Magic was a part of daily life. Spells, charms, rituals, divination, prayers to, pagan gods, things like that were there. That was life. That wasn't really considered witchcraft. Witchcraft was considered basically baneful magic, what we would now consider, quote unquote black magic, although I don't really care for that
I
term.
don't like that either.
But the spells that we now consider ethically questionable,
Right.
but the kind of magic that is the reason why it was easy for King James to get away with eventually transitioning that translation over from the original word to witch in the King James version of the Bible, which is basically what happened, by the way, is King James just completely he commissioned a translation, and he had his own issues with witches, and there was witch hunting, heavy witch hunting in England and Scotland during his reign. But he did have a special commissioned version of the Bible where the word witch was put in as a substitute for the earlier word, which in the Greek version of the Bible was the word pharmakos. And I actually took Greek in college, so I have a little bit more of an understanding of some of the nuance of Greek translations than some other uh, people do, just because of familiarity with the language. But pharmakos was originally translated as a sorcerer or a poisoner,
Hmm.
specifically a poisoner who used like potions or magic in order to harm people. So the reason why witch was so easily subbed in was because of the association that the word already had a negative connotation to both potions and magic, that he was able to just tie it to witchcraft entirely.
Yeah, that guy was a fucking dick. Right before he did that too, he published his own book of demonology. Like that was it. And his book on demonology was entirely, I don't want to say entirely because that's not true, but very heavily based on the Malleus Maleficarum. And I can go all day about the asshole that wrote that one, and I won't do that right now, not yet. But maybe later on in the podcast, I can go on a little tangent about that fucker and how he kind of paved the way for it being about women. And so, yeah, King James really like hooked into that, wrote this book on demonology, and then was like, you know what else we need to change? The Bible. Let's do that too.
Yep. And yeah, I can also go on many tangents about how witchcraft, both in its earliest forms and much later, was about women, um, and women's power. Um, for one thing, one of the few ways that women in most ancient societies could get any power was to do things that were of questionable legality because of the laws in place to prohibit women from having power. And one of those things was, helping other women, whether that be through midwifery or poisoning, which actually was extraordinarily common in the ancient times and the Middle Ages because of issues like arranged marriages and the fact that there weren't really a whole lot of laws in most places to protect women against their husbands. So poisoning was a huge problem in the ancient world. And there have been many instances where women were arrested, tried, killed, whatever, because they were caught either poisoning their husbands or providing poisons so that women could poison their husbands. And so the usage in ancient language against, suffer not a poisoner to live makes a little more sense, than suffer not a witch to live, because in the ancient times when that would have been written, magic would have been used medicinally. It would have been a midwife's job to cast the proper protection spells. It would have been a wife's job to cast the right fertility spells, to ensure both the protection of the home and the hearth and the family. Like all of these things would have been absolutely normal. So punishing all spellcasters would have been seen as absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. Something that, I would have to look it up a little bit more. Ronald Hutton makes a claim that that pharmakos word, because it's translated as a sorcerer, that it was a gendered word and that it was actually a male sorcerer. Is there any kind of truth to that, or?
So I don't have the text directly in front of me, that the original like
Right.
word itself in the original Greek. I would have to go back and find that specific book. But the word pharmakos, yes, is the male version of that word. But I do know that there were gendered words that were used based on profession less than they were based on the individual in question. And pharmacos was also used for like medicines and things like that that were provided that harmed people, even accidentally. It was seen as a really, really bad thing to give someone medicine and then hurt them with said medicine, like a doctor in the modern day being taken to court for malpractice.
Gotcha.
Same kind of concept in the ancient world. And because in the ancient world, the profession of doctor was largely restricted to men, it makes sense that the word would have been gendered, even if it wasn't unilaterally applied that way. Because there were a lot of women who would have been doing poisoning with their magic. A lot of women use baneful magic to protect themselves or to attempt to protect themselves. But it wasn't, in my opinion. I think Mr. Hutton might have been a little bit mistaken there, that it wasn't targeting men specifically in the Bible. I think it was targeting an, a job category more than a person.
Okay. And, you know, it's been a couple of weeks since I've read this. I could be either mistaking this book for another one of the books I read, but so Hutton's never going to fucking read this. But if you're listening, I'm sorry if I misquoted you. But it's when did it it seems like it's always kind of been about women. I think the Salem Witch Trials are a little different because when you look at who was accused, it fucking ran the gambit between poor people, the super wealthy people, men and women. It didn't fucking matter. There was a defining factor. I won't get into that, but like it really didn't have much to do with the gender. So Salem, people love to look at Salem and be like, look, look, look. That's not really a good example, right? So when did it kind of shift from being this like term about a a profession a profession that was generally about men to, well, now it's being about women specifically?
In my opinion, it probably shifted along with the focus of the church itself. Because in the earliest form of the church, women were respected as teachers and leaders. Um, we know that
Mm-hmm.
from
Yes.
textual evidence, and it has slowly over time, women lost power in the church. I say slowly because it took place over the course of a couple hundred
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
It seems like it was really quick to us, 2,000 years later almost, but at the time it was a slow creeping process. You have church leaders that, were even written about in the Bible who were women. Like I believe Paul writes letters to some women
Yeah.
leaders. And but I think that the slow loss of power that women had in the church as a whole kind of translated to society, because women flocked to Christianity in the earliest church,
Yeah.
because Christianity offered them an equal seat at the table, or
Absolutely.
relatively equal anyway. Um, and so in societies where women didn't have a lot of power, that was extremely appealing. Like in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, women were not powerful figures at all. They had limited power in some ways, like, wealthier women obviously had more power than lower class women, et cetera, but that's
Kind of like here
universal.
where like white women have more privilege than BIPOC women, but we're all still oppressed.
Exactly. Yeah, but as Christianity spread away from Greece and Rome and was taken up by the higher members of society, and it spread beyond into Northern Europe, groups that traditionally actually gave women a little bit more power, like the Norse cultures and some of the Northern European, like England and Ireland to a certain degree, not quite as much as Norse, but some of those cultures actually did give women a little bit more power than other groups did. Um, the focus on equality in the church was less important for the church itself to maintain power. So it was easy for them to ignore that, in my opinion, that slow shift as society itself shifted. And as the church started taking over these other cultural areas where women already had more power, it became important for them to assert the church as a figure of authority over those cultural groups. And one of the ways that it did that was, oh no, you guys are backwards. You're giving your women way too much power. And so when women would try to take back some of that power using stuff like witchcraft, they would immediately swoop in and cry, demons.
Of course, yeah. Rain, I'm curious your input on the Norse aspect of this, because you are a Norse heathen. Do you have any insight on the equality of the Norse people and the Norse pantheon and religion as a whole?
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that in the sense that men and women weren't entirely equal, but there's a lot more history around female warriors. This idea that women had more of a say in society and more of a say, especially in the communities. And in terms of the deities, and that's where I think the Christianization of a lot of these practices, these pre-Christian pagan practices, is when oral tradition was later written down, it was through a Christian lens. It was Christian authors who were taking those stories and I'd like to think to the best of their ability, tried to translate them into storytelling, but as Christians did that in a way that ended up manipulating some of that information, if not a great deal of it. And so I think what we have now that remains in the lore, in heathen lore specifically, is that the goddesses aren't as involved in the stories. I'd like to think that, that might have been different. There's a lot of power with the goddesses. The goddesses hold a lot of power. And if you look into it, like, yes, Odin is, the god of wisdom, amongst many other things, but it's actually his wife, Frigg, who knows like everything. Like, she is actually the wisest and she knows, but she doesn't talk. She's not in the sense that she can't speak, but like, she doesn't talk about what she knows. She has the ability to see into the future and I mean, everything, like anything you could possibly imagine, she can do it. And then she doesn't share that knowledge. Whereas Odin, actively sought that and sought sort of status with that. So I think there's a lot of evidence that women, the women deities, had great power. But with the way it was written down, it kind of gets lost or pushed to the side.
Yeah, I'm not really surprised with that because Christians lost their own goddess. They got rid of their own goddess, and the Jewish religion also got rid of their goddess. So, they were both like two god pantheon, and they're like, fuck women,
Well, and I will say, Catholicism, while it's not the same, does have holds the Mother Mary in high esteem. And you'll regularly find shrines to Mary in Catholic churches, if not in the sanctuary, close to it. And I think it's not the same, but it does speak to this idea that the goddess wasn't forgotten entirely. She was just sort of reassigned, and I think that's echoes again what we see with pre-Christian oral traditions being written down, those mythologies being translated. It's like, oh, they're there. They're just no longer a priority.
Yeah. It's, you mentioned Mother Mary and Catholicism. I think it's funny that they choose to venerate Mother Mary, but we have Mary Magdalene, who is Jesus's wife. I don't care what anybody says, that's Jesus's wife. And we don't have anything for her, but like the mythos of Jesus with Mary is supposed to mirror the mythos of Yeshua and Sarah. Anyways, but so like there was a god and a goddess, and so there was supposed to be a god and a goddess over here, and Catholicism was like, we don't need Mary Magdalene, but we'll do Mary the Virgin, which is interesting. But neither here nor there. I think Catholicism is like the closest Christianity has kept to being pagan, personally.
I regularly get asked when I do workshops or any sort of facilitation pagan event, how did you become pagan? Like, were you born into a pagan family? I'm like, no, I was Catholic, and I could full stop right there because to me, once you start explaining uh, the rituals and transubstantiation and the way that that the faith is practiced, like, yeah, it absolutely is the witchiest of the Christian practices. There's so much in the way that particularly the priests, like the ritual garb, the sanctuary space, like the way that it's very, everything is very sacred, and the idea that the host and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. Like, it's not a metaphor. It's not like, oh, we're just envisioning this. Like, no, we're actually consuming Jesus's body and Jesus's blood. How pagan does that sound?
Well, like I was always told growing up too, like we don't like the Catholics because they're bad, and like I never understood why. And I was going to Catholic mass when I was in high school because of the person I was dating. We were pseudo engaged. This is high school. This isn't real, you know. But like we thought we were gonna get married, and so I was going to Catholic mass for him, and I was just like, whatever, it doesn't seem as scary as everybody says it is. And then when I fell out of faith and started getting into witchcraft, the first time I went to Catholic Mass after like being in witchcraft for several years, I was fuming leaving the church because I was like, these motherfuckers think I'm crazy. You do the same thing as me, but you're just in a big room rather than doing it by yourself. Crazy.
Yep.
Crazy. So yeah, so about the we see that with the Norse deities, they've been very heavily Christianized. Do you know anything about magic practitioners specifically within the community, and like at all, either of you really? In the Norse community?
I know a little bit, because again, my the reenactment history that I've been studying. So the Norse actually, in some of their earlier sagas, some of the even like there were some sagas that were written down pre-Christianity, but very, very late, like pre-Christian, and a lot of them were very like patchy. Like we don't have all of the saga, for example, that kind of thing. Um, but like one of the ones that specifically mentions witchcraft it talks about a woman who comes into the court of one of the jarls and is extremely feared and respected. But the jarl in question calls her there to do some divination, and she is referred to with the same name as they use for other seeresses. I believe it's vulva is how it's VOLVA, and she practices a lot of different types of magic, but she specializes in what is considered the women's magic, which is the Sather or Satyr, depending on your pronunciation. And that particular kind of magic was the Norse are interesting. Their magical practices. I don't want to get too deeply into it because it's not entirely relevant in terms of historical context. I just know a little bit about it. Rain can probably speak much more to this actually, but their magic is heavily gendered. And so her using the women's magic and yet being so heavily respected and feared, to me at least, is fairly significant, to show like the place that women had in that community pre-Christianity.
Yeah, and I'll chime in a little there. I think you nailed it, and that particular story is really all the history we have on Sather and how it was practiced. We really don't know much beyond that, and it's a paragraph basically on everything that modern day practitioners who choose to practice Sather will draw from. And yes, it was very gendered, and that's why you see that because Freya taught Odin say it was considered, I'm going to say unmasculine, but really the language is more nuanced than that. If you look at the Old Norse, in the sense that it was considered to be a woman's role, been because of that, and also Loki because of that, are known. We use the word today gender fluid. That they have that flexibility to take on more than just their traditional masculine role, and therefore would fall under the category of today what we call gender fluid, which I think is pretty sweet. There's a lot of breaking of norms in Norse mythology that I appreciate, and gives a bit more, I think, shape and depth to the practice. But I will say this, going back to witchcraft, it's typically thought, the practice of Sather is not thought of. People call it Norse witchcraft. It's really not. It is a very specific practice, and definitely falls more under the seership, as Shayna said, to be able to receive messages and translate them for the community, for an audience, but is not spell work. It is not the manipulation of energy that we typically think of as witchcraft. It's really its own entity, and I think that's why a lot of heathens don't take on the word or self-define as a witch, because it's really two different practices that we're talking about.
That's I mean, it's fascinating anyways, because like, not just within the Norse, but it's like if you backtrack and you see that the European witch figure just meant magic that was bad, and then they changed what they defined as being bad, and so we just kind of get this big umbrella term for all magic at some point. But when you look at magic practices throughout all cultures, it's not just women that do it, it's men that do it too. But it seems like it's consistently women that do divination. And so, again, I have my own opinions about why maybe witch was chosen for the Bible, especially since it was based off of this divination, right? So if mostly women did divination, and we are a very patriarchal society, how can we demonize more women? Oh, let's use the word witch because now, that's gendered, and then, let's keep piling things in that umbrella term, and then always target the already seen as a minority group. So I feel like just magic as a whole has always been activist based, and has always been equality based, and has always been a fight for justice. And that's just my opinion, but
I think it's very community oriented, and would say that is not something you practice by yourself. It is something that is done before a group, and I think the same is traditionally true of what we now call witchcraft. Any sort of magical practitioner was helping somebody, whether it was a herbal remedy or what have you. You could even say the women who were poisoning their husbands situation is a effort to help, because they were in such a bad situation that became their solution. And so I think over time, and especially in our day and age, I think defining witchcraft as having a basis in activism is true, in the sense that it's always action-based for the community, on behalf of the community, for the betterment of the community.
Yeah. We see it really big in the spiritualist movement too. I find it very interesting that it was like all these women are like, yeah, I can't speak in public. Joke's on you. I'm not talking, but Abraham Lincoln's speaking to me now that he's gone. I don't know. I gotta talk now. And he said free the slaves. That's what he said. So like this. So it's like it's just interesting because I feel like we just keep. It's both sad and interesting. It's sad because I feel like we keep having to have these same fights with the church. We keep having to have these same conversations with the church. But it's interesting because as a society, I feel like we know intrinsically that what is happening to us and around us is wrong. And so we're like trying really hard to course correct and go back to our roots, which is magic, which is activism, which is equality, which is community, which is get these motherfucking billionaires out my house. Like,
And I do want to jump in just a little bit there, just because I've studied fairly recently, at least my interests have turned super ancient, like the origins of religion kind of ancient. And this actually, oddly enough, I got started looking into this because I was looking into the origins of board games. And board games were invented as an early form of divination. And so I started looking into like ancient divination practices and ancient magical practices. And a lot of what you see about ancient magic and ancient religion is it kind of, humans are humans are humans and always have been and always will be, where religion was used as a way to explain the universe, but it was also used as, a tool for power. And witchcraft was used even when it was used in conjunction with religion, because in a lot of ancient tribal communities, shamanism is like part and parcel of the role of the whatever the priest would have been called of that community. The priest and the shaman were often the same person, and shamanic practices, tied very heavily into, what we now consider witchcraft practices. But also there oftentimes, even in those communities, there was still a separate role of a witch type figure who would have been more of the healer, more of the direct, like where the shaman would have been like, I'm talking to the gods and seeing what they want. The witch would have been more like, okay, well, I'm over here setting bones and making potions and delivering babies. And that's almost, I don't want to say universal, but it's certainly very common in ancient communities. And so this role of both the shaman and the witch often went to marginalized members of the group. And that's kind of a chicken and egg kind of situation where it's like, are these people better at being shamans and witches because they are marginalized, because they are, not of the typical gender norms, because they are disabled, because they have like other qualities to them, or are they put in that role because that is the best role that they fulfill in that society in order to be like productive members of society? And like I said, chicken and egg kind of situation, but it eventually becomes in a community where the only roles that are filled by those disabled, gender fluid, or gender outsider kind of roles are the witch or the shaman. These heavily religious, heavily powered, like powered isn't quite the right word, but like they have a different kind of power than like your chieftains or your like the military leaders would have had.
yeah, I mean, that's so. I feel like what I'm looking into is going to spiral into the birthplace of religion at some point, just because of all the craziness I've been doing. Um, but it is like really interesting to see that we do have almost this universal concept of magic and community and people who don't really fit in the society. And I feel like that's why, at least in Europe, when we start get to see the witch hunts and whatnot, why it's always the social outcasts and social outliers that get targeted. Like, it's easy and they're already there and they're already doing stuff, and if we want to control the populace and we want to have a homogenous looking society, we got to get rid of the others. So rather than trying to incorporate them into the community somehow, we're going to shun them. And we're going to make what they're doing be not okay. I wanted to kind of circle back, Shayna, too, to what you were saying about the practices in Africa. Ronald Hutton does go into that towards the beginning. And, I have issues with his book in certain areas. One of the issues I have is the fact that it's very European centered, in the fact that he only uses the European definition of witch, of somebody who did something bad with magic. And so when you look at it that way, like, you get that everywhere. That's everywhere. But what I did see was that when he was talking about places in Africa and certain people in Africa, their witch figure was not killed. Do you know what I mean? Like, if somebody was accused of being this, like, witch figure, it was like, you got to pay a fine, or you owe something back to the community, or you have to publicly apologize. It was like, we got to get together, we got to work this out. Because a lot of groups believed that being a witch was like, that figure was like inherent, like having magical powers was like inherent and already in you, but you could sometimes do shit to people on accident just because you were mad at them. And so if there was a feud going on and one of the people within that feud would get sick, the person that was having the feud with the sick person would be like, hey, you got to come down, we got to talk this out. Like, what is happening? Like, you gotta apologize, you have to, like, make amends, we need to be together as a community. And I find that so interesting, this, like, crazy, like, it this juxtaposition of all these other communities, whether it be the Norse, or places in Africa, or places in, oh gosh, I think it was like Norway or something, where their, like, witch figure wasn't murdered. So where is that coming from? Do you have any inclination of, like, where, like, why are we getting this, like, hyper aggressive kill spree in Europe?
It's going to sound a little ridiculous if you aren't familiar with super early human history, but it's because of the Neanderthals.
Okay.
So super, 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 super early human history. You have in the fossil record, and you have some of the extant, like, substance, like, material record. You have a lot of evidence of, like, culture groups in Africa and Asia who were less violent than in Europe. And they definitely had war. They were
Oh
absolutely
yeah.
violent. There was, there's violence all over. Like I said, humans are humans are humans, and they always were, and they always will be. But part of the extreme reaction that Europeans, particularly, in my opinion, have to the others of their community, rather than trying to incorporate the other into their community more fully, trying to find a good role for that person, Europeans were much more likely to kick them out or kill them, in my opinion, because of the fact that the Neanderthals are closest what we consider non-human, but no, technically they are human. They're just a
Mhm.
different type of human. Our closest non-Homo sapien relative lived longest in Europe.
Mhm.
Um, and so the most current, I guess you could say, like, muscle memory, like cultural memory of fighting with another non-human group, another group that we would consider literally not the same as us, like not the same race, not the same, like like
Well, because back then it's a
species.
species, yeah.
Yeah, back then it was a species issue, like, but at the same time they also intermarried with them. Like, there is a lot of recent evidence that they did incorporate them into the community, through marriage and or marriage, quote unquote, because oftentimes it was probably much more violent than that. But we're not going to get into that right now. But they were still warring with them on a fairly regular basis, and they definitely saw them as, like, the other is a problem. Whereas in communities in Africa, Asia, North and South America, the other was not a persistent, in your face problem as late into their cultural historical memory as it was in Europe.
That's
That's
interesting.
my opinion anyway, but it's based heavily on what we know of ancient history.
I mean, I don't want to make this like a weird, sidestep into, talking about race and whatnot, but I mean, uh, I have heard people in the BIPOC community be like, oh yeah, white people are violent. They're violent. And when you look at our history, European history, it's fucking violent. It's awful. And so I had no idea. I mean, the podcast I'm listening to right now, specifically about Christianity and the beginning of Judaism, the podcaster, he does talk about how the Neanderthals were still like around, kind of where he's talking about of like Assyrian, Babylonian, time frame. And it like blew my mind. I was like, oh, we don't think about that. We don't think that it's actually a lot closer to us than, like, when you watch TV, you watch the History Channel, it's like, oh, it's a pile of old bones. It's a fucking fossil. I mean, so they were after the dinosaurs before us. They died out. Somehow we were here. That's not how it worked, right? Like, we didn't just show up here, right? And it's crazy to think that at one point there was like 3 different species of like humanoids like living on the planet at the same time. And yeah, that's wild. I didn't realize, I didn't make the connection until you said something. That's crazy. But like, there's validity in that. I would agree with you now that you've said that, and kind of going back and listening to conversations within the community, and when we talk about racism and violence, it always goes back to like, well, like white people are like really aggressive and really violent, and it's like, oh shit, well there might be a reason for that. Like, wow, that's not good.
I mean, if you think about it in terms of cultural context, I've heard a lot of debate, at least in recent years, about like, well, why are Asian communities so like community focused, whereas Western cultures are so individual focused? And I think a lot of it, like same kind of concept, it goes back to, Asian communities were building, like they were focused on building the community, whereas a lot of Western cultures were focused on, I have to get what I can get because somebody else might take it from me. I have to fight for what I can get because there's this other, species over here competing with my people for the same resources.
DNA is weird. That's all.
Yep.
Yeah, genetics is fucking weird. Like we still have like weird body parts. We don't know what they're for. I don't know. Let me not get into that. But it's it's so crazy to think about in that term. Um, where was I going with this? I did have a question. I promise I did. Um, so the witch gets demonized, right, more heavily in Europe. What did the original witch hunts look like?
So that is it's also an interesting question, because I'm very much not Catholic. I grew up in the American South and I was very Southern Baptist. And so I don't know a whole lot about the Catholic Church other than what I was taught in, my history classes. And a lot of that wasn't as focused on the church, which is ridiculous if you think about it, considering how powerful the church was in the Middle Ages, especially. So what I do know of the church in the Middle Ages, and what I do know of the witch hunts, actually, are that there is a huge, huge misconception about witch burnings and the witch trials. And what I know of it is that the witch trials actually got worse the further along you get in the church's history until you get to the Enlightenment era when they kind of died off, um, and were replaced by other forms of oppression. But anyway, um, but it seemed to me that the witch trials got a lot worse when Protestantism was growing. And there is also a huge misconception in the witchcraft community about the burning times. And I hear that term all the time, and I absolutely hate it because witches were typically not burned. Witches were punished in a number of ways. There was, the duckings that they used to determine innocence or guilt. Ducking being, of course, when somebody was thrown into a body of water, and if she floats, she's a witch. But if she sinks and therefore dies, of course, she's innocent and has been taken into the arms of God. Um, you know, Fortunate for that supposedly innocent person. But anyway. Um, Basically, burnings were limited to heretics. They put people to death for witchcraft. That was absolutely a thing, and it absolutely happened. But when you hear of people being burned at the stake for witchcraft, it was often one of those situations where they were being charged on multiple offenses
Hmm.
because they were put to death not for being a witch, because especially early in church history, similar to what you were referring to earlier, like in African societies, when you were accused of witchcraft, you weren't immediately killed. You were given the chance to repent. You were given the chance to, you know, sometimes pay a fine or be punished with whipping or other punishments. And then as time went on, it got more severe, the punishment in question. But burnings were specifically reserved for heretics or people who spoke out directly against the church's teachings.
Which also included just denominations of Christianity that they didn't like, which I always find hilarious. And I say hilarious, like not actually haha way. It's just like, oh yeah, we just keep having the same argument. Um, and Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, and people say that she was burned for witchcraft. She was not a witch. She was a devout Christian Catholic person, and she was burned for heresy. So can you tell us what heresy is? Because what I have learned through all these different things I've been looking into, Ronald Hutton, a couple of the podcasts, is that heresy was also an umbrella term, kind of like witch. Witch was more specific, but heresy encompassed witchcraft and then a bunch of other shit. So is that
Mhm.
where the misconception or the misunderstanding is coming from? Like, what is heresy?
Yeah, that in my opinion is 100% where the misunderstanding is coming from, because and as I said, I'm not Catholic, so I can't give you like the church's definition of heresy. But as a concept, like as a social concept, heresy was basically doing anything the church didn't like. Heresy was speaking out against the church or putting forth information in theory that contradicted what the church was teaching at the time. For example, Galileo was accused of heresy. Um, uh, Joan of Arc was accused of heresy because she said that her strategic insights were given to her by angels. And that was considered to be, no, nobody talks to angels. What are you talking about? Like, angels don't talk back to you anyway. That was considered heresy. And similar cases throughout medieval history where people were accused of heresy just for saying something that a church leader did not like.
And so, where do witches get mixed up in that? Because um, there are a couple of things I've been hearing through my podcasts are like, oh, this person, you know, was accused of witchcraft and then charged with heresy and then burned. So if they were accused of witchcraft, how would they then get charged with heresy rather than witchcraft?
So witchcraft was also kind of an umbrella term. It was consorting with non-religious approved spirits, essentially. Whatever you claimed that spirit was, whether the church said that it was a demon, or whether you said, oh no, it's the fae, or it's a ghost, or, similar kind of situation. The church basically said, no, no, all of that stuff is the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's a gross simplification, but basically, witchcraft was getting information from and using that information for whatever purposes. You're consorting with any kind of spirit or entity that is not holy, quote unquote. Like anyone who is not, you know, God or a saint or something like that. Um, and saying that you're talking to a saint was even looked at pretty sketchily because are you really talking to a saint, or are you talking to a demon who is impersonating a saint? That kind of thing. Um, and when I say talking to, prayer is not quite the same thing, although witches were often accused of praying to the devil, and praying to demons. Generally, it was the spirit entity talking back that was the problem.
So Joan of Arc. So I'm trying to like figure out this timeline, right? And I know I'm probably like picking your brain, and you're like, Lou, I don't have all the shit in front of me. What the fuck's wrong with you? But like, I'm trying to just figure out this timeline, right? Because you get Joan of Arc, who says that she sees angels or is talking to angels. Heresy. But then later on, we get, well, that's not an angel, that's a demon, therefore witchcraft. So like, like, is it just an over time? The church was like, we got to demonize all of it because it's getting crazy and out of hand. What is the timeline?
So you have to remember, at least for Joan of Arc's case, that it was very highly politically motivated, as witch trials often were. Witch trials and heresy trials universally were very politically motivated. Joan of Arc was killed by a church tribunal under the English, and Joan had been defending and raising an army for the French.
Mm.
So you have to think about that in context, where was it the church who was accusing her of heresy and witchcraft, or was it the English, and the English portion of the church was just giving their approval? Because this, of course, was Henry VIII. This was way before the English church broke off and did its own thing. And of course, you also have to think about the church in the Middle Ages as being a highly fractured political group. Um, it makes American politics look like child's play. Um, the church in the Middle Ages was like you could cross a county line and suddenly be in a completely different like religious like sect. And they were all technically Catholic, at least up until the Protestant Reformation, but that didn't necessarily mean that they agreed with each other, liked each other, or weren't going to kill each other.
And so they had their own set of laws. And so they were just like, no, fuck you. You fucked up. So,
I mean, there were even times where the question of who is in charge of the church was up in the air. So like if you can't even decide on like who the pope is, how the hell are you supposed to decide on like what standard heresy falls under?
yeah. So it's like just really convoluted, really confusing. Nobody knows what the fuck is going on. And so we get the Protestant Reformation. Um, I'm bad with history, like date numbers. I know that the Puritans came over to like get away from that. Um, can you talk a little bit about that? I don't want to dive too much into the Salem Witch Trials because their shit was completely different from what was going on in Europe. But obviously, they took these beliefs about witches with them over here. So, can you speak to a little bit about like the church and like the timeline of all this is going on? It's tumultuous. People are like, oh, we don't have faith in the church because they don't know what the fuck's going on. We have to leave. Now we're going to go. Like, what?
Yeah, so America really likes to talk about being a haven for religious freedom early in its history. And that's a great ideal, but it's actually kind of hilarious because oftentimes the groups that were coming to America for quote unquote religious freedom were religious extremist groups who were in trouble with the church of their homeland for whatever reason. And in the Puritans' case, it was because they were a lot of hard asses who didn't believe that the Church of England was being strict enough.
Yeah.
So they came over here and they practiced their quote unquote religious freedom, um, by, oppressing a lot of people and eventually hurting a lot of people with the witch trials as just one example.
Yeah.
But
They fucking hated the Quakers.
oh yes, oh yes. I mean, but there was a lot of groups like that, especially because the Americas were first starting to be settled very shortly after the English Civil War. And the English Civil War was very religiously motivated. Like, of course, it was very politically motivated as well. The politics and the religion in that particular era were very incestuous, but um, a lot of political groups fled to the Americas as religious groups, or they were later identified as religious groups, but they were actually just political groups who, they all practiced the same kind of weird extremist version of Christianity that they didn't really like either the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. They were like, neither of y'all are cool. Well, let's go over here and do our own thing.
Man, if only that would happen today. So I don't, yeah. So I just wanted to kind of like ask that because I do think it shapes at least American history, and I would love to do on a different episode with you about at least like religious history and religious history here in America. Because when you do look at the witch trials, that definitely played a part of why they killed so many people, why they were accusing so many people. Um, the witch trials, the common misconception is that the witch trials in Salem was about land disputes. There was only one, two warring families about a property line dispute, and it was a misdrawn property line. And the church just wouldn't take care of it because they were like, it's not our fucking problem. You guys work it out yourselves. So that was like the only one. The rest of them, it was just differences in the way they practiced Christianity, and they either were already accused of witchcraft somewhere else at some other time, or they had a family member already accused of witchcraft, and they were just like, yeah, fuck you too. So it was just like, oh, that must be why you don't do Christianity right, because you're a witch. So Salem's a specific beast that I want to do a whole different episode on.
I mean, the Protestant Reformation in general is absolutely rife with accusations of witchcraft from both sides
Mm-hmm.
because the Protestants saw the Catholics as being way too mystical and religious, like ritualistic with their religion. Except in the super, super early versions of the Protestant church, they were just as ritualistic because they took a lot of the same practices that the Catholics were doing and they just kind of took them over here and just did them slightly differently. So, like, the early Reformation was just so many people going, I don't like the color of that candle, you're a witch.
How am I not surprised? Oh my goodness. And well, yeah, and so like we talked about like okay, so Catholics were being accused of being pagan. That's always my favorite one because growing up I was not told that they were pagan. I was just told that they were evil slash they did it wrong. And I didn't understand what that meant, right? So like they're the most pagan, so like I can kind of see like, oh, okay, you hated pagans. Okay, okay, okay. Like it was shit on the Catholics, right? They hated Quakers though because they were like praying silently. Like it was, I don't know, it was just weird, like weird shit. But also Jewish people. We talked about that a little bit earlier about being accused. Well, maybe I wasn't recording it. I don't remember. But we were talking about Jewish people. They were accused of witchcraft a lot too, and they were accused of like eating babies, which is something that got ascribed to witches later, but it was originally something that they accused Jewish people of doing. That I think is an important part about witch history that doesn't get talked about enough. Can you speak to how the Jewish community was treated during the witchcraft trials and what about their I don't want to say culture, but like what they were doing got absorbed into this idea of the European witch.
Right. So you have an issue, I guess you would call it, where cultural racism, cultural, hatred that is very deep in the Christian church, well, various groups in the Christian church. Basically, there was a very common theme in the Middle Ages where Jews were basically blamed for killing Christ, and that was a good excuse for them to. Uh, basically vilify the entire religion. But it was also a way for them to be able to punish and other and oppress the ethnic group that the Jews were a part of. Um, And so a lot of Jews were basically considered culturally heretical because they weren't Christian. And they were like seen as a problem because they would refuse to convert if, asked to do so. And it was a huge problem where a lot of their cultural practices were kind of made like almost a uniform. Like they were assigned specific clothes that they had to wear, and they were assigned specific ways that they had to identify themselves. Like we in the modern day have this not to draw too much into like World War II and like the Holocaust, but um, Jews were labeled for hundreds of years well before the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Like they were given literal uniforms, like they had to wear specific hats, specific clothes, specific colors, things like that in different areas based on who they were. They were assigned to live in specific areas of the city. They were restricted from being able to participate in certain like jobs and things like that. Like that was one of the reasons why they developed a reputation as usurers, as debtors and bankers, was because that was one of the very few jobs that they were often allowed to have in a city, because that job as a debtor or a usurer basically was not considered to be an okay job for a Christian to have, because at least religiously it was considered sinful to engage in usury. So of
Mm.
course the Jews were the only ones who were allowed to have that job available to them, because being a moneylender was still necessary for society, but the Christians didn't want to dirty their hands doing it themselves. But anyway, that gets into witchcraft because a lot of the stereotypes that people had about the Jews were later assigned to witches. A lot of the clothing that we currently in the modern day associate with, well, I say we in the modern day, not we as in the witchcraft community, but like the like Halloween, the creepy witch look, like the witch costume, is often derived very heavily from Jewish clothing. In part, it is also drawn from other culture groups like the brewers, who sold beer. But it's a similar kind of costume, so it could be drawn from both. It could be drawn from one or the other that just happens to look kind of similar. But anyway, uh, that's part of the reason why the stereotype of the witch evolved into the look that it eventually had, was because it was very similar to what the Jews were required to wear.
I want to circle back a little bit, not too far, because you're talking about how Jewish people weren't allowed to have a lot of jobs, and they were looked at as like, oh, it kind of it struck a chord with me about what we were talking about earlier when it comes to people who were like disabled or marginalized and they couldn't do certain things in society, so then we like gave them these roles. It's so, I mean, obviously it's fucked up. I think it's interesting, but it's also fucked up that we take this group of people and then we forcibly like make them disabled. We tell them they can't do certain things, that they can't be a person, and then we demonize the things that they're doing. I know I could go on a tangent about that all day, but I just find it interesting, because if you're gonna constantly accuse the social outliers and then also force them to do the necessary jobs, I don't know. It's just like it hits me wrong.
How else can you ensure that they're doing those necessary jobs if you're not keeping them oppressed?
Right, exactly. Which I mean, I know, like we're all preaching to the choir here, but it's just
Yeah.
like it fucking irritates me when you learn stuff like this throughout history, and then we're just doing it again. Like we're just doing it again. So, yeah, I want to kind of half-assedly gloss. Oh, actually, wait, back up. So, brain squirrel. So the clothing and stuff. I know the pointy hat, that was something that was seen. I know that is also the inspiration for Hitler making them wear the star on their sleeve during the Holocaust. Was historically, all of that. Um, and that fucking sucks. Was there any other group outside of Jewish people, right, that were accused of being witches? Like, obviously women, but like, was there any other group that we can like point to and be like, also this one?
Yeah, the disabled
Mm-hmm.
and other ethnic groups. Um, Anytime that there was an ethnic group in Europe, they ran the risk of being accused of witchcraft. Like I was talking about the Romani earlier, they were frequently accused of heresy and witchcraft. Also, there was some issues in the Middle Ages with a couple of the courts when they would have denizens from the Middle East or Africa. They would have visit the court, and if literally anything happened while that person was at the court, they would get accused of um, not necessarily witchcraft, but it was kind of like witchcraft adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
Like poisoning was often a very common accusation when one of these people would visit the courts. Like in the French courts, there was a scandal at one point with one of the African dignitaries who was on the hush hush accused of adultery with I think one of the queens, and it was a huge issue. And of course, we they didn't have issues with racism in the same way that we would think of racism in the modern day,
Mm-hmm.
but they definitely saw other cultures as more mystical, like the Orient, the word Orient, having the connotations that it does in Western culture is because of this tendency of Europeans to see other culture groups as mystical and magical and just like having that like obsession with other cultures and other religious groups because they saw them as both appealing, like they were
Mm-hmm.
fascinated by them, but also they were horrified by them. So there was constant accusations of issues like witchcraft and heresy when other groups would visit.
Thank you for pointing that out. I think that that part of the conversation gets lost too. Like, I see a lot of the discourse online about witchcraft, and it's always about women, women, women. That is true. I don't want to, like, I have a femme body. Like, I get, I've had my own issues with that. Um, but Jewish people were accused of it, and lots of my other minority groups, the disabled and BIPOC people, or like just even if it wasn't BIPOC people, obviously it was, because then once we start having people enslaved, I mean, Tituba in the Salem Witch Trials, she was accused like fucking right off the bat because she was like the one of the only enslaved people there. So, I think that part of the conversation really gets lost. We don't talk about it enough. And it just, for people, especially in America, if they are BIPOC and then also calling themselves a witch or a magical practitioner here, they get like doubly persecuted. Like, white women here, it's cool. You got crystals in your bra, fuck yeah, light up an incense stick. But I feel like in Western culture, we still look at especially black women as being these like super mystical, mysterious, magical. We love them, but also they're too scary to actually be near. And so, their what they do for their spiritual practice gets looked at like that's bad. But what Karen is going and paying $50 for at the store is okay. Like, I just wish that people like talked about that aspect more, especially since, at least, because of my opinion of it being very activism based, right? That we need to help lift up our intersectional communities more.
That's why in a lot of my opinion of the way witchcraft is portrayed in media is incredibly problematic because it uses that tendency of Western culture to exoticize other cultures to basically use horrific stereotypes to portray witchcraft in media. Like, I would say 60% of what we're exposed to in witchcraft media is just really shitty stereotypes of hoodoo and voodoo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like the way that witchcraft is portrayed in TV shows and the way that it's portrayed in movies here in America, at the very least, is like 90% like really sketchy shit about voodoo that is like largely not true, obviously. Um, but I mean, even the stuff that is even remotely true is still like it's portrayed in such a way as to make it horrifying intentionally because it is seen as this exotic, weird thing. And it's so easy for everybody to vilify it because it's got such an other state in our culture.
Yeah. When did it start to die down as far as like the belief in witches? Because that is something that I have seen too within my research of like at some point the church was like way too much going on with witchcraft stuff. It's not working. We're like killing people left and right. How about instead it's just not real? And obviously, the people here in the colonies did not get that memo, and they were still doing crazy shit. But in Europe, that was dying down. Can you like explain a little bit like why it was dying down and what did, um, you know, I guess the judicial system look like? Because if they weren't being accused of witchcraft, but there's still others in the community, what was being done instead?
So, in Europe at least, where the witchcraft, the witch trials and everything really started dying down, was during the Enlightenment era, which would have been the 1600s, late 1600s into the 1700s. And the Enlightenment was universally about science and reason and logic, and religion as a whole kind of died down a little bit during the Enlightenment. Now, everybody was still pretty heavily religious because that was such a part of their lives at that point. But there were even at that point people going, God's not real. Like atheism skyrocketed in,
Mm-hmm.
in context, of course. Um, going from a 1% of the community to 5% of the community is still an enormous jump. Um, but that's when it really started, was the Enlightenment era. And with the Enlightenment, of course, you had lessenings in the witch trials in Europe. I believe the last witch trial it was in the 1800s, but it was like the early 1800s technically. But I don't remember exactly where it was, and it wasn't even like a witch like a heresy burning kind of deal. It was literally just somebody was accused of using witchcraft in conjunction with other methods to as the kids like to say these days, unalive somebody. Um, and um, basically, with the Enlightenment, you had a huge push towards logic, reasoning, science, and a lot of earlier practices that would have been considered part of witchcraft, by modern audiences, like alchemy, for example. A lot of people lump alchemy under the witchcraft umbrella. In the Middle Ages, of course, it would not have fallen under the witchcraft umbrella at all, but alchemy was lumped under that same umbrella, but it was still practiced during the Enlightenment. It had just eventually evolved into science. Um, and the parts of it that didn't evolve into science were some of the stuff that lived on into and eventually became the like spiritualist movement and the Golden Dawn and like Hermeticism and things like that. Um, but yeah, I'd say short answer, the Enlightenment.
I think it's really interesting that they were just like really hard and heavy, and then all of a sudden it was just like, well, nope, like we're done with that. Like it's actually just not even real. And this, I think I mentioned it earlier. This idea of like, well, the church, anytime it made like the church look bad, they would like demonize it, right? Well, the demonizing wasn't really working anymore, and so it was almost like they pivoted. They were like, well, we still need to be real. So if we say that we're real but nothing else is real, then they don't have power anymore, and then we can just like it'll just go away. And in conjunction with the Enlightenment, I think it was easy for them to pivot in that way because people were already starting to lose faith in stuff, which is really interesting. And yeah, so obviously the colonies did not get the memo. I would love to do another episode with you because we did not get into the Malleus Maleficarum, and probably for a good reason, because that would probably just be a whole hour in and of itself. And we did not get into the Salem Witch Trials specifically. But I hope that for everybody listening that this was really educational as far as, like, you know, European witchcraft and what we've seen is complicated, and it's a lot more complicated than people think it is, and what people think it is not even what it was. So, like, no burnings, like, no, not all women, like, just, it's a lot of misunderstandings and a big game of telephone. And so I hope that for everybody listening, you learned something, and you got some of your beliefs challenged, maybe a little bit. That's my hope. Does anyone have anything else to add?
Just thanks for inviting me to ramble on about things I'm super nerdy about.
Thank you for being here. I'll definitely have you on again because, like I said, I've got a whole list. So, Rain, do you have anything?
I'm just in awe over here. Like, I'm, like I said before we started recording, this is not my area whatsoever. And Shayna, listening to you talk and paint the picture of history and really explain the context of so much of, you know, we hear bits and pieces of things, but to really get to know the historical picture, I could listen to you talk all day. That was awesome.
Yeah, no, you're definitely going to be back here, and unfortunately for you, having to deal with us, me specifically. I'm wild, but yeah, no, it's great, and we love it, and you know, thank you for educating the community. I think it's really important. So with that in mind, hopefully I will force Shayna back here eventually. Thank you so much, and bye.
See ya.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the Witch's Table. If you'd like to add your voice to this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewitchesaltar.com.